This audio program presents horror, which is frightening and disturbing. You let us into your mind at your own risk.
As the sunlight fades to darkness, the frightful tales creep into your mind. It's time to give in to your fear, because tonight there will be no sleep. Brace yourself for the No Sleep Podcast.
It's the No Sleep Podcast. I'm David Cummings. Thanks for joining us. On the show this week, we have 6 tales about terrifying treasures, fractured families, and touching terrors. We have 2 new talented contributors joining the show this week, an illustrator and a voice actor. Our illustrator is Abby Howard. Abby creates the apocalyptic horror webcomic, The Last Halloween, as well as the far less grisly graphic novel series, Earth Before Us. She's a writer, an illustrator, and a lover of both dinosaurs and the macabre. Thanks for your great art, Abby. Welcome to the show. Our voice actor is Tanya Milevich. Voice acting is a passion of Tanya's, and the last decade has been filled with numerous voice acting roles of all types, both challenging, emotional, and fun. She's enjoyed putting voices to characters since she was a 10-year-old with her tape recorder. Horror has been a part of her life from the moment she discovered Stephen King back in high school. She's been a member of the audio drama podcast community for a few years now, and she loves the positive, safe, and creative space it offers. Welcome, Tanya. Thanks for sharing your voice with us. Check the show notes for links to where you can learn more, see more, and hear more from Abby and Tanya. And speaking of hearing more, we have lots for you to hear right now. The tape is in the machine, the stories are ready, so let's press play. In our first tale, we meet a woman who is being sent a series of VHS tapes, not a common format these days. But as author John Grills explains, it's what's on the tapes that has left the woman deeply disturbed as she tries to solve the mysterious puzzle therein. Performing this tale are Nicole Doolin and Dan Zapula. So try to find the questions being asked when the only choices for answers are yes, no.
I didn't think much of it the first time a VHS tape showed up in my mailbox. Who even uses VHS tapes anymore? It was unwrapped with no label, resting on top of the other mail. It had been a couple of days since I'd even gotten the mail, so I had no idea how long it had even been in there. I just tossed it on the counter with the rest of the junk mail and went about my day. A couple of days later, another tape showed up in my mailbox. Again, this was weird. But I don't have a VCR, and I don't know anyone who does. It's not like I could just go to Best Buy and pick one up. Maybe a pawn shop would have one. But I really didn't have enough interest to put forth any effort over 2 random VHS tapes. Who would? It was after I got the 3rd tape the next day that I had enough interest and annoyance to just order a cheap VCR off Amazon for $45. Which I thought was almost too much. But if I knew then what I know now, I would have spent more. It took 2 days for the VCR to arrive, and in that time, 2 more tapes showed up in my mailbox. I'll admit that by that time, I was interested enough in what was going on that I wanted to see what was on the tapes. But I also knew well enough that I might just end up looking at a tape of some guy dancing around naked in front of his camera. Or more likely they were blank and had just conned me into buying a VCR. Which, if you think about it, would be a kinda cool marketing campaign. But the tapes weren't blank. It took me a little while to get the VCR hooked up to my TV, along with a trip to the store for a cable they either didn't pack or I didn't realize I needed. Finally, I slid one of the tapes I received into the machine with that familiar click and hum that brought me back to the days of being a middle school kid getting her hands on the once fabled Faces of Death tapes and regretting seeing the monkey scene. Or a flash of college, when the internet was still new enough that people actually paid money to buy VHS tapes off late-night infomercials of people getting naked at Mardi Gras and spring break. All things considered, I would have been happier seeing the monkey scene again. Or even a naked guy dancing around on my TV. The black screen buzzed for a moment with the nostalgic tracking kicking in, as the image adjusted before cutting to a face I knew. My brother, Dan. He was sitting in a room, his back to a brick wall. The camera was zoomed in far enough that I could only see his head and the top of his shoulders. He just sat there staring at me. It looked like there was something dark under his nose, but the quality of the tape and the cheap VCR was so shitty that it was hard to tell. It kinda looked like he'd had a bloody nose. Thinking this was some kind of stupid internet prank that I wasn't up on, like rickrolling or something, I grabbed my cell phone and dialed his number. It went right to voicemail. Of course it did. It had to be a prank or some of his art house bullshit. Asshole. I sat there on my couch watching the tape of what felt like my brother watching me. He just stared at the camera for a couple of minutes, kinda looking nervous before his eyes started to dart back and forth like he was thinking about something really hard. Finally, he spoke.
No.
Then nothing. He just sat there for a while before starting to think again. Then, once again, he spoke.
No.
This went on for 10 minutes. The next word was yes, then no again. Those were the only words he would say, after what started to look like more and more frantic moments of thought. Then the tape ended. I didn't get it. I can't imagine how I could have gotten it at the moment. I called Dan again and again got voicemail.
You reached Dan. Leave a message, or don't.
Dude, I don't get what's going on, but you owe me $45 for buying a fucking VCR. Could you at least have sent me a tape of something I'd enjoy? Like 80s anime or something? Whatever. Call me when you get this, and at least let me in on what the joke was supposed to be. I tossed the phone on the counter and looked at the tapes. I didn't immediately put in another tape. I don't know if it was that I wanted to talk to Dan first, or if it was something else. But it wasn't until the next morning, when I still didn't get a call back from Dan, that I put in another tape. I sat down with a cup of coffee and pressed play. Again, after a few moments of black, Dan's face appeared. This time, his left eye was almost swollen shut. It was puffed out and purple and almost shined. It looked so raw. I choked on my coffee, burning my throat in the process. What the fuck? I said it as if Dan was going to answer. Again, he just stared at the screen for a while before finally speaking.
Yes.
His voice trembled this time. Another 10 minutes went by of him saying only yes and no randomly, before he got this panicked look in his eyes and the video shut off again. I called Dan's cell again, and again it went straight to voicemail.
You reached Dan. Leave a message, or don't.
Dude, what the fuck is this? This isn't fucking funny. Just call me back. I don't know if you hooked up with another one of those performance arts chicks or what, but I'm not laughing. Call me back. I put in another tape. They had been scattered on my counter at some point, so I really had no idea when I'd gotten each one. I swore when I saw Dan's face appear seconds after pressing play on the third tape. His nose was bleeding. His eye was a grotesque purplish yellow, and blood ran from his mouth.
Yes.
When he finally spoke, I could see that he was missing several teeth as more blood poured out of his mouth. I scrambled to grab my phone. I called Dan again, but this time his voicemail box was full. He lived alone. No roommates, no girlfriend, nothing. He was an artist who spent all his time doing some kind of shit I didn't understand. Sometimes he traveled for art shows or gallery openings. He wasn't great about returning calls, but I didn't believe for a single moment that he would be doing some kind of performance piece this fucked up and just leave me hanging. Or would he? I had no idea. He was my brother. I loved him. He was the only family I had left, but we were different people. I didn't think like he did or like the people he spent time with. Some of those people he hung out with would do some weird fucking shows just to get reactions. But this wasn't just makeup. If this was real, even if he was doing it to himself, it was beyond the pale. He needed help. I tried to remember the name of one of the galleries Dan had sold stuff to, but blanked as I stared at his broken face. As I searched Google for galleries in the area, I started to mumble to myself. Is this a fucking joke?
No.
I froze, my eyes slowly moving from the phone to the TV. I wish I could say that the wheels were turning in my head and I was figuring it all out. But in that moment, I was stuck in neutral. I wasn't thinking about anything. I just sat there and stared at the television screen as Dan spoke again.
Yes.
His words were a jumbled mess, the letters slurred. If he had tried to say anything other than yes or no, it would have been impossible to understand. Still, I couldn't shake the simple thought. Dan wasn't just saying yes or no. He was talking to me. I grabbed another of the tapes and put it in. This time it was Dan's face, completely clear of any marks. He sat there stoic and composed. He breathed slowly and after a while looked up, like he was resigning himself to the moment, and spoke.
No.
Then again.
No.
Then again.
No.
Then.
Yes.
The tape cut out as Dan just stared at the screen. I wanted to warn him, yell at him of what was going to happen. I ran out of my house and checked the mailbox. It was empty. There was one more tape sitting on my counter. I walked back into the house, afraid to play the last tape, not sure of what I would see. Would it be something in between what I'd already seen? Would it be an explanation of what was happening? Would it be something worse? The face that appeared on the screen might not have even been my brother. If it had been the first tape I'd watched, I don't think I would have watched any more. His face was so beaten and bruised and smeared with blood that it looked like a mask. He was missing his right ear and most of his teeth, and that's just what I could see of him. And still, after a few moments, he started to talk.
No.
He was slowly shaking his head. He knew he could barely say the words and had to help them along.
Yeah.
He nodded his head. He was trying to talk to me. That was the driving force behind it all. The will to keep trying something. Anything to get me to understand. He wasn't saying anything. He was answering questions. Questions he thought I would be asking. How he was even managing the words through the pain on his deformed face, I don't want to imagine. I finally called the police.
911, what's your emergency?
My brother's been kidnapped.
What's your name?
Michelle Polke.
And your brother's name?
Dan Polke.
How do you know he's been kidnapped, ma'am?
I got these tapes in the mail.
What kind of tapes?
VHS tapes. I got 5 of them over the last week or so.
What's on the tapes, ma'am?
It's my brother. Each tape he looks more and more beaten up, like he's being tortured.
Is there anyone else on the tapes?
No, just him.
Does he say anything about his location or abductor on the tapes?
I don't know. All he says is yes and no. I think he's trying to tell me something.
Do you think he's trying to answer questions for you, ma'am?
What?
I said, do you think he's trying to answer questions for you, ma'am?
I don't know. I guess so. I think so.
Okay, stay there, ma'am. Someone will be there soon.
I went to the front door and left it open for the police, hoping they would get off their lazy asses and actually help out. I grabbed the first tape again, the one where he wasn't hurt, and I put it in. I wrote down all his yeses and nos, and I tried to work it out. Over and over, I tried to write down the questions I thought he was trying to answer. But there were too many options. Was he telling me he was okay? Was he trying to tell me directions? Was he trying to identify his abductor? There were so many options, and I just couldn't slow my mind down enough to concentrate. I hadn't received any more tapes. Dan might have been dead, and I couldn't even figure out the question to his first answer. So let me ask you, if someone took you and gave you a chance to be saved, but could only answer yes or no to a conversation you had to imagine having with the person you chose to save you, what would you say? If your life depended on answering yes or no to questions that someone else would have to ask on their own accord, what would you say? Because no one is good at this game. I guess most people can't even guess the rules by the end of the 5th tape. And the game goes on. That's why I'm telling you. Because I get to. So you understand the game. Because Dan was all I had. With him gone, I have no one. So I leave it up to you. Yes. No. No.
Exploring the woods is a common and usually fun pastime for kids. But don't tell that to author William Delphin. In his tale, a young boy discovers something in an old burned-out cabin in the woods, and he soon finds that someone wants it back. Performing this tale are Kyle Akers, Erica Sanderson, Alexis Bristow, Jeff Clement, and Ellie Hirschman. So be careful poking around old burned buildings, and definitely never steal a canister from the ashes.
I was 9, going on 10 years old. We lived in a small town in Vermont, in a large greenhouse at the crest of a steep hill. Up the street from us, the road ended at a large forest. My brothers and I would walk up there and play in the shelter of the thick tree branches. None of the trees were suitable for climbing, but enough had fallen over that we could build makeshift forts from their remains. We'd explore the pine needle carpet for bugs, whack through the ferns with sticks like explorers, or just play hide and seek in the dense thicket. Just beyond the edge of the forest at the top hill, there was a little stream. Beside the stream was the burnt-out skeleton of an old house. We'd been told that the property belonged to somebody, so stay off. But on occasion, we felt brave enough to explore the wreckage and find buried treasure. One time, which was to be the second to last time I ever dared set foot among the blackened walls and scattered junk of that house, I found a small cylindrical container. My brother was busy looking through a pile of dead books. The moment I picked up the container, there came the snap of a twig behind us, setting both my brother and me off at a sprint from the site and deep into the heart of the woods. When we caught our breath, I realized that I had taken the container with me. So I twisted and clenched at the screwed-on cap, trying to get it open, but I couldn't. My brother egged me on, but when given the opportunity to prove his might, he too failed to pry the jar open. And so, the jar remained a mystery to me for several days. When we returned home, I hid it in a drawer I kept for things I found lying around, called my junk drawer. It wasn't until my friend James came over to play that weekend that the contents of the jar were discovered. When I showed him the canister, he instantly snatched it up and began trying to open it to see what was inside. His face turned red with the strain. He groaned. His hands shook, but lo and behold, the lid made a grinding sound and shifted. Eagerly, we fought over taking the cover off the rest of the way, but James won out, as he had been the one to get it open. He twisted, he popped the lid, and immediately we were assaulted by a powerful smell. I shied away, disgusted by the aroma, which to me was like a mix of baby powder and a bar of soap. James held the jar away from his nose and gagged.
Smells like puke.
Resecuring the lid, we took the jar outside to keep from drawing my parents' attention to it. We went down a hill in the backyard, toward the swamp located on the outskirts of the property. There was a large rock there, where I had discovered a crag suitable for hiding things I didn't want found. We opened the jar again, blanched at the smell, then looked inside. What we found was some sort of cosmetic makeup, thick and buttery, and the color of skin. I suggested to James that he try putting some on, and he gagged at the thought. We had no idea how long it had been in the jar, and we certainly did not want to get that smell on us. People would think we'd been rolling around in a field of old ladies. I resealed the lid on the jar and tucked it into the nook in the rock, obscuring it from sight. The next day, my family left to go see an air show that my sister's boyfriend was a part of. I'd been temperamental, got in a loud argument with my mother, and was ultimately left behind to fend for myself. Half an hour after they left, there was a knock at the side door. I went to see who it was, and there was this middle-aged-looking lady standing there. She had dark hair and brown eyes, and was tall and slender. She was wearing a big overcoat. She smiled at me through the glass outer door and asked if my parents were home. Naively, I told her they weren't.
Do you mind if I come in and wait for them to return?
I didn't know who she was, but the last thing I wanted to do at that point was upset my parents by refusing to let in a friend of theirs who'd dropped by. I opened the glass door, only to find that the air outside was heavy with the smell of that jar of makeup. Only this time there was some underlying odor beneath it that made me queasy. The woman reached toward the door as if to take a hold of my wrist, and I quickly shut the door. I felt really hot all of a sudden. The air seemed thicker. "I'm sorry, you'll have to wait outside. I'm not allowed to let people in who I don't know when I'm by myself." The woman looked disappointed. Her brow seemed to furrow for a moment as if puzzling over my behavior. And then for a moment she seemed angry. I felt scared by her expression. And before I'd even thought about what I was doing, I shut the door in her face. She knocked a few more times, then got quiet. When my family returned, they came in by themselves, talking and laughing about the air show. I asked them if the woman was still outside, and they asked me what woman I was talking about. I told them about the woman who had come to the door and asked about them, then asked to come in. They told me I'd done the right thing by not letting her inside, and then I got a lecture on talking to strangers, or even answering the door when I was home alone. I saw her again on Monday when I was at school. It was recess and we were all outside playing. I was taking part in a game of soccer. The ball got kicked through our goal and disappeared into the bushes by the edge of the schoolyard. I went looking for it and came out on the nearby road. As I picked up the ball, I felt the sudden need to look up. Just down the road from where I was standing was the woman in the brown overcoat. She was beckoning to me with one hand, while the other seemed to be holding her coat shut. On the breeze, I could smell that same smell of baby powder and soap that the contents of the jar smelled like. I fled back onto the soccer field. Tuesday, I couldn't get the smell out of my head. I awoke to it smothering me. It masked the taste of my cereal. It was there with me on the bus, in the homeroom, during silent reading, at recess, at lunch, at gym, at every one of my classes, and all the way home. My tongue felt ready to shrivel up in my mouth. When I got home, the smell slapped me in the face at the front door. Exasperated, I threw my backpack down and ran back outside and down the path to the swamp. I turned around the corner of the large rock, and the woman was there. Her back was to me, but it was clearly her, in her large overcoat. She was hunched over, muttering to herself, and I could smell that choking aroma all over her. As soon as I stepped up around the bend, she stopped what she was doing and, with her back still to me, stood up, set the jar of makeup down on the rock, and turned to look at me.
You took my makeup. I had lost it, but you found it. I can't go out without my makeup.
She turned her head all the way around, and I saw her entire face. Where she hadn't yet applied the makeup, the skin of her face was red and swollen. It was covered in blisters. In some places it was black. She looked like a cooked piece of meat. She cocked her head slightly and smiled at me, half normal, half burned.
I just wanted to say thank you for finding my makeup.
Her eyes seemed to say otherwise. I was frozen in fear. As I watched, she pulled open the front of her overcoat, revealing a tattered black dress. It wasn't black to begin with, I was sure of that. The bit of it that fluttered and hung off of it had some sort of floral print. But almost the entirety of the dress was burned to cinders. Beneath it I saw more blackened flesh. Her shoulders, her legs, her feet, and a pair of roasted heels. All of it was burned. And the worst part of it all was the smell. She smelled like she was still cooking. Even as she stood there exposing the destruction of her body to me, she seemed to be shriveling and flaking away, and the air was rife with the aroma of it all.
Don't I look better now?
She reached out to grab me, and I ran. She yelled at me. It was almost more of a wild growl, like a wolf bearing down on an animal it plans to eat. I sprinted up the path, never looking back, for I was certain she was right behind me. Her smell, the smell of her roasted body mixed with the smell of makeup. It was all over me. I jumped the steps to the side porch and nearly injured my shoulder, throwing myself through the door in the same instant that I opened it. I didn't want to risk it being locked or jammed. If it was, I was going to bust it down to get in before she touched me. I was out of breath when I stumbled into the kitchen. I was babbling and waving my hands frantically. My mother watched me for a moment from the sink, thinking I was playing some sort of game. Then her nose turned up in disgust.
What is that awful smell? What have you been up to?
There's a burned-up lady chasing me.
Is this some sort of game? I watched you from the window here, bolting up the path like it was you that was on fire.
There's a lady down in the swamp. She's all covered with burns. Well, now that got my mother moving. I was warned that if I was lying, my father would hear about it. This was not the sort of thing to make jokes about, I was told. My siblings overheard the commotion, and before I knew it, everyone in the house was marching down the path to the swamp. I led them around the rock to where the lady had been, but as you would expect, she was gone. The canister of makeup had been dashed against the stone face. Broken glass was everywhere, as was the goopy concealer. And the smell. My brothers and sisters covered their noses and turned back home. I was dragged home by my arm, scolded and punished. It was weeks later that my brother and I were back at the burned house in the woods, looking at blackened books and other junk. I'd been having nightmares ever since the incident with the woman, but somehow I did not correlate the fact that the jar of makeup came from this old ruin of a building with what had happened. It wasn't until I found the smoked-over glass and brass frame, pulling the yellowing photo from it, and I saw the black and white picture of a middle-aged couple that I realized. As I knelt there, my hands shaking as I looked at the photo, I heard a whisper from somewhere close.
I can't go out without my makeup.
There was a clatter of junk from behind me, and I turned in a panic. My brother was standing there, leafing through a brown book. He looked up at me and grinned.
A little jumpy?
His expression paled suddenly. He dropped the book and ran, stumbling over the rubble. I felt a pair of hands on my shoulders. Before they had a chance to grip my shirt, I took off after my brother. We hid in the woods for almost an hour. We had plenty of practice at not being found among the ferns and branches and falling logs. When we finally felt it was safe to come out, we broke from our hiding spot, sprinted for a path we knew and followed it out, not once slowing down. We hit the pavement of our street and continued our dash until we were home. We never went back to that place, ever again.
Many people long to leave the busy city life and find a more peaceful rural existence. As shared by author Leo Harrison, one man decides to purchase an old house far from the city while his wife teaches overseas. But when strange dreams and mysterious things start happening, it becomes clear that his home might not be so peaceful. Performing this tale are Mike Delgadio and Tanya Milevich. So when you're looking at buying a home, make sure you check the room upstairs.
In the summer of 2014, I settled into a new house, rural, far from the city limits, and free of the city's hollering drunkards and roaring mufflers. It was a quiet and quaint place, a rundown shingle-style home with brown cobblestone paneling decorating its exterior. When it grew dark there, only frogs and cicadas disturbed the quiet evening. And if I lay on the hammock I'd hung in the woods behind the house, I could look up and see 7 or 8 stars, which was at least better than seeing none at all. Because I knew that my wife Ellen would soon repatriate to the U.S. from South Korea, where she'd taken a temporary job teaching English to young students, I spent the chilly mornings and humid afternoons preparing the house for the two of us, mending all the structural problems that were so nicely concealed by our home's appealing exterior and, well, so sadly indicative of our financial strain. By day, I'd go about repairing the plumbing or the air conditioning, while the boughs and leaves of the trees would brush up against the windows, the sunlight filtering through the